Chapter 1 UAP Disclosure and Sovereignty. Whatever one thinks of the Pentagon reports on UFOs that was released in June of 2021, it marks a turning point in the history of the relationship between state power and close encounters. This would obviously be true if one believed the US government's claim to have come clean about everything that it knows regarding UAP or close encounters with supposedly unidentifiable ultra-high performance craft. But it is even more true if, for some very good reasons that will be given in this chapter, one disbelieves the official narrative. If the government of the United States is changing its tune from "we cannot confirm that they are real UFOs, and even if they were, they pose no threat to national security," to the line, "there are genuine UFOs, namely objects that are apparently maneuvering under intelligent control with performance capabilities far in advance of ours, objects which we cannot identify or explain, and they potentially pose a threat to both flight safety and our national security," then something terribly significant has taken place. After an overview of the recent so-called disclosure in the first section of this chapter and a look at a kind of UFO threat to national security, in the second section, the following two sections will make the case that more is being covered up about close encounters than is being disclosed. One part of the narrative being promulgated by the supposed champions of American UAP disclosure is that with the release of the Pentagon information confirming the existence of UFOs, serious scientific study of the subject can finally happen. This is preposterous. As Section 3 demonstrates, serious scientific study of UFOs has been ongoing for decades at a highly classified level and has most likely come to some very detailed and definite conclusions. The fourth and final section considers why this has been covered up, with an emphasis on the implications of the UFO phenomena for fundamental structure of state sovereignty. 1.1 Putative UAP Disclosure The Pentagon now admits that numerous types of data have been collected on these unidentified aerial phenomena including gun camera video, thermal imaging, sensor readings, radar tracking, and satellite photography. This information was collected and analyzed by Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program (AATIP), a secret UFO study group within the Department of Defense, which was headed by Louis Elizondo, a military intelligence officer. AATIP was set up in 2007 with the support of Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, a UFO disclosure enthusiast representing the state where Area 51 is located, who helped to secure a measly $22 million yearly budget for the office. It operated out of the Pentagon's C Ring until 2012, when the program was defunded. Supposedly after resigning from the Defense Intelligence Agency in 2017, Elizondo teamed up with Christopher Mellon, a former Deputy Secretary of Defense for Intelligence under both the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations, as well as Staff Director of the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, in order to leak a number of videos from the AATIP archives to major media outlets such as the New York Times. These leaks began with two Navy airmen and an object that accelerated like nothing I've ever seen, an article co-authored by veteran UFO reporter Leslie Kean and published in the New York Times on December 16, 2017. The article focused on Commander David Fravor and Lieutenant Commander Jim Slade, although over time it would be disclosed that at least two other Navy pilots were also involved in their close encounter. On November 14, 2004, about 100 miles out in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego, the two pilots from the USS Nimitz were instructed by the nearby USS Princeton to pursue an anomalous object that was being tracked on radar. What followed was an extended close encounter of the first kind with a white Tic-tac shaped UFO that hovered over the ocean, then mirrored the flight pattern of Fravor's jet before outmaneuvering him and the other pilots involved in the incident by repeatedly changing directions and locations in a manner that defies conventional physics conceptions of inertial laws as they would apply to an aircraft. Of course, this aircraft had no wings or any other protuberances, and yet it was able to instantaneously change directions, making sharp angular turns without banking and shooting straight up or down, while soaring at tremendous speeds. At one point, the Tic-tac changed altitudes from 80,000 to 20,000 feet in 1 second. Much of this was captured on thermal imaging video and radar, although the object was also able to disappear from radar. This story, which was covered by Fox, CNN, NBC, CBS, and other mainstream media outlets, was the first of a series of such video leaks. One of the others involved mysterious triangular or pyramid-shaped aircraft also filmed off the coast of San Diego, displaying the same stunning maneuverability as the Tic-tac undergoes. Perhaps the most intriguing of these releases, at least for neophytes, was thermal imaging video from the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Omaha on July 15, 2019. In the dead of night, servicemen aboard that vessel observed a metallic sphere maneuvering above the Pacific and then plunging into the ocean. Later, radar recordings were released that demonstrated that as many as 14 UFOs swarmed the Omaha simultaneously. Media coverage of the incident included admissions that US Navy nuclear submarines have, on numerous occasions, sonar tracks as unidentified submersible objects, USOs, or UFOs that enter and exit the oceans, traveling at a speed of hundreds of knots underneath the water, a performance capability that outdoes our submarines in as humiliating a fashion as UFOs outperform our most sophisticated classified aircraft. By the summer of 2020, these leaks served to resurrect AATIP in the form of an unidentified aerial phenomenon task force under the auspices of the Office of Naval Intelligence. This marked the first time that the United States government set up a publicly acknowledged UFO research and analysis group since the US Air Force shut down Project Blue Book in 1969. Finally, on December 27, 2020, President Trump signed a $2.3 trillion coronavirus relief and government funding bill that strangely had tucked into it an order to the Director of National Intelligence, DNI, John Ratcliffe, to submit to Congress within 180 days an unclassified report which would include a classified annex that gathered together everything that the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, knows about UFOs or UAP. On March 22, 2021, now former DNI Ratcliffe had this to say on Fox News sometime after the 180-day countdown to disclosure had begun. Frankly, there are a lot more sightings than have been made public all over the world. There are instances where we don't have good explanations for some of the things that we've seen. And when that information becomes declassified, I'll be able to talk a little bit more about that. After much anticipation, for many months, the Preliminary Assessment on Identified Aerial Phenomena report was released on June 25, 2021 by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence with approval of the US Secretary of Defense. We got only 9 unclassified pages out of an 81-page report. One of those pages is the cover and another is the index, so the report is actually only 7 pages. Despite a mandate to release what it knows about UAP, the intelligence community limited its report to analysis of UAP incidents from November 2004 to March of 2021. In other words, the report only engaged with the period during which AATIP was active. Despite this, the authors of the report have the audacity to assert that the limited amount of high-quality reporting on unidentified aerial phenomena hampers our ability to draw firm conclusions about the nature or intent of UAP. Really? What about the 7 decades of high-quality data that the US Air Force, the US Navy, and the other branches of the Pentagon have amassed from encounters that their pilots and sailors have had with UFOs since at least the early 1950s, when the phenomena was already being seriously studied by the US government? The authors admit that the US Senate specifically demanded that the report include a detailed analysis of UAP data and intelligence reporting collected or held by the Office of Naval Intelligence, including, emphasis added, data and intelligence reporting held by the UAPTF. Close quotes. This does not restrict the scope of the report to the UAP Task Force or AATIP research, but explicitly demands all UAP data that the ONI has ever collected or even held. While the Office of Naval Intelligence has decades of high-grade classified data on UFOs or USOs entering and exiting the oceans near naval vessels or tracked by sonar of US submarines navigating underwater at impossible speeds. Furthermore, the claim that USAF data collection has been limited historically is a blatant lie. The USAF has amassed a monumental archive of data on close encounters, going all the way back to the flying saucer scare of the early 1950s. Some of the most serious incidents documented by the USAF at ICBM launch sites of US AFBs will be reviewed in the next section of this chapter. Do the authors of the report, which was signed off on both by the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense, really think that by rebranding UFOs as UAP, they can file these 7 years of data on UAP away in a different cabinet and act like they are not relevant to the assessment that was mandated here? These lies are compounded when the report goes on to state that in a limited number of incidents, UAP reportedly appeared to exhibit unusual flight characteristics. These observations could be the result of sensor errors, spoofing, or other observer misperception and require additional rigor analysis. Close quotes. The term spoofing in a military intelligence context refers to deliberate manipulation of sensor readings or interference with them that causes false readings. So, sensor errors, that just happen to be of the same type every time, or deliberate hacking and manipulation of sensor data could be responsible for extraordinary UAP performance characteristics that multiple pilots and sailors are also seeing at the same time with their own eyes. How stupid does the US government take you to be? Abysmally stupid. Retarded, in fact. The report admits that in addition to UAP that could be explained as airborne programs, some of them are either foreign adversary systems, or they fall into a catch-all other bin, This catch-all other bin is, of course, an understated way of saying potential alien spacecraft or interdimensional vehicles or some other even more exotic form of extra-mundane and unidentified intelligence. First of all, to use the phrase catch-all other bin, when referring to these possibilities is cowardly. It is even more duplicitous to say that only a handful of UAP appear to demonstrate advanced technology, and then go on to detail 18 incidents described in 21 reports where this kind of technology has been demonstrated. A handful means about 5, not 18. Furthermore, the report actually admits that 143 of 144 UAP incidents that it covers cannot be explained. One turned out to be a balloon. So, the handful statement and even the 18 cited contradict the part of the report that admits that 143 of the UAP remained unexplained and 80 of these were registered on multiple sensors. These sensors included radar, infrared, electro-optical, weapon seekers, and visual observations. Granted, those 18 may have been cases where the most extremely anomalous performance characteristics were demonstrated, but if multiple state-of-the-art sensors could not identify 80 UAP, then these must certainly also be considered genuine UFOs. Again, these are only a minuscule subset of the UAP or UFO data going back 70 years that the US government has carefully collected and analyzed at least since 1950. All of that having said, here is how the report describes the anomalous performance characteristics of some of the UAP that were analyzed by the Pentagon and the IC. Some UAP appear to remain stationary in winds aloft, move against the wind, maneuver abruptly, or move at considerable speed without discernible means of propulsion. In a small number of cases, military aircraft systems process radio frequency RF energy associated with the UAP sightings. The UAPTF holds a small amount of data that appear to show UAP demonstrating acceleration or a degree of signature management. Additional rigorous analyses are necessary by multiple teams or groups of technical experts to determine the nature and validity of this data. We are conducting further analysis to determine if breakthrough technologies were demonstrated. The entire report's failure to clearly differentiate between this other category and foreign adversary systems, leaves the reader, including all the senators in Congress reading this report, with the impression that countries such as China and Russia may have developed technology that is far in advance of our own and that has repeatedly displayed dominance over the US military, engaged American military assets, sometimes swarming them, and violated restricted US airspace with impunity. Some UAP may be technologies deployed by China, Russia, and other nations, or a non-governmental entity. This ambiguity is especially disastrous when it comes to the next significant line in the report. UAP clearly pose a safety of flight issue and may pose a challenge to US national security. Following an expansion on the flight safety issue, the authors elaborate on the implications for national security, again conflating the aforementioned other category with potential for an adversarial technology. UAP would also represent a national security challenge if they are foreign adversary collection platforms or provide evidence a potential adversary has developed either a breakthrough or disruptive technology. Close quotes. Further on in the report, this disastrous statement is expanded upon under the header Potential National Security Challenges. Underquotes. We currently lack data to indicate any UAP are part of a foreign collection program or indicative of a major technological advancement by a potential adversary. We continue to monitor for evidence of such programs given the counterintelligence challenge they would pose, particularly as some UAP have been detected near military facilities or by aircraft carrying the USG's most advanced sensor systems. Let us just pause for a moment to take this in. Up to this point, from flying saucer underquotes scare of 1947 until the present, the US government cover-up of what it knows about UFOs has left the public to assume that it is possible that the Pentagon had not only thoroughly studied UFOs, but might be engaged in a substantive reverse engineering effort in order to provide us with defensive capabilities against whoever is piloting them. Even after the Condone Committee report in 1969 that concluded Project Blue Book, the impression was that maybe the US government had things under control and the secrecy could be to the benefit of citizens, because the military-industrial complex was busy working to build us our own fleet of flying saucers to protect Earth in the case the aliens underquote should ever prove hostile. Bob Lazar certainly fueled this suspicion. Now, not only does the US government reverse its position in the Condon report by admitting that UFOs do in fact pose a potential threat to national security, the Pentagon and the Director of National Intelligence claim that they have no idea what these things are and they might be manufactured by China or Russia, which would mean that the USA is a backwards, militarily inferior nation as compared to these foreign adversaries, despite taxing American citizens to fund a military budget larger than that of the military budgets of these rival nations put together. What is the report's conclusion? Give the Pentagon more money. Recall that, to begin with, this report is part of a funding appropriation bill. The UAP report concludes that much more extensive study is needed by multiple teams of experts. Better sensor equipment also needs to be more widely installed on military assets in areas or contexts where UAP encounters have taken place. More significantly, the authors call for the stigma of reporting UAP to be eliminated and insist that it is the duty of pilots and sailors to report anything of this kind and for a standardized and careful reporting protocol to be developed for the purposes of data collection, including by the US Air Force. A specific emphasis is placed on coordination with the Federal Aviation Administration, calling on the civilian airline pilots to participate in data collection for a more large-scale analysis to be carried out by the new UAP task force. In other words, the bottom line of this assessment is that it normalizes UFO sightings reports and even encourages them to build a database for scientific analysis by the Pentagon. Senator Marco Rubio, who is concerned that UAP may represent a threat to US national security by a potentially technically superior adversary, seems to have been instrumental to the mandate for this UAP preliminary assessment by the Pentagon and the US intelligence community. A couple of months into the 180-day countdown to the June 25 release of the report, Senator Rubio, speaking to the media, said, "The bottom line is, if there are things flying over your military bases and you don't know what they are because they aren't yours, and they are exhibiting potentially technologies that you don't have at your own disposal, that to me is a national security risk and one that we should be looking into." What is Senator Rubio talking about when he says that UFOs have been flying over US military bases? He did not get that from any of the video footage released by the Navy from 2017 onwards, which features only UAP observed during operations in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Nor were such incidents detailed in the 9-page unclassified report released to the public on June 25. Rubio, as a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, got that information from classified briefings that he has received on UFOs. It is information that any competent UFO researcher would be aware of. UAP and Nukes. In the fall of 1964 at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, Lieutenant, now Dr. Robert Jacobs of the 1369th Photographic Squadron was the officer in charge of photo instrumentation responsible for filming missile launches from the Big Sur coastline. 2 CIA agents confronted him about a film of a missile test that he has shot at night, which clearly showed a flying saucer intercept a dummy warhead after it had separated from the missile carrying it, and then circled the warhead while shooting beams of light, or laser beams, at it. The UFO then flew away at high speed, while the warhead plummeted to Earth. The CIA agents told Lieutenant Jacobs that he was never to speak of this again, and that the incident never happened. Jacobs' senior officer, Dr. Mansman, who was in the room where the film reel was played, later told Jacobs that after he left, the men from the CIA confiscated the film and classified it top secret. On October 24, 1966, 2 UFOs that were tracked on radar hovered over Minot, US Air Force Base in North Dakota for more than 3 hours. Not only were they sighted by numerous personnel from multiple vantage points as radar facilities tracked the luminous balls, there were extensive radio communications regarding the observations until the UHF transmissions themselves were disrupted by the static apparently emanating from the UFOs. Most alarmingly, these 2 UFOs were not simply on some kind of reconnaissance mission. They activated the launch countdown of the nuclear missiles without proper authorization codes being entered. In other words, the missiles were about to launch themselves at the Soviet Union, and inhibit switch had to immediately be flipped to override the imminent launch. At 4:49 p.m., a security team was dispatched in response to safety alarms activated at the Oscar 7 nuclear missile silo at Minot AFB. When they arrived on site, they saw that the massive 20-ton reinforced concrete door to the silo had been forced open without any tire tracks or any markings left in the area by whoever had accomplished this. It is worthy of note that the director of operations at the base submitted a full report about this incident to the Air Force's Project Blue Book, which, having been initiated in 1952, was ongoing at the time, prior to its disclosure in 1969. 6 months later, 2 even more alarming incidents occurred at Maelstorm Air Force Base in Montana. The first incident took place at Echo Flight Facility on March 16, 1967, and the second on March 24 at the Oscar Flight Facility, which are separated by about 35 miles on the vast base. On those 2 days, a total of 20 nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles were disabled so that they could not have been launched by officers such as Lieutenant Robert Salas or Lieutenant Fred Maywald, who were on duty at the time. The missiles were about a mile apart from each other and had independent backup power sources. Regardless, as a 90-foot diameter red glowing oval hovered over the Flight Launch Control Center at Maelstorm, this UFO was able to put all of these nuclear missiles into a no-go status, taking about 10 seconds to disable each missile. Engineers called in from Boeing checked every possible reason for the missile's failure, but were not able to offer any reasonable explanation for the incidents. They concluded that an electromagnetic pulse would have had to have been directly injected into each of the silos, penetrating 60 feet underground to disable the missiles. When the US Air Force shut down Project Blue Book in 1969, it cited as one of the reasons for the program's closure that no UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force has ever given any indication of threat to our national security. As noted above, the Director of Operations of Minot Air Force Base reported the October 1966 incident there to the Blue Book project managers, and as for the incident at Maelstorm Air Force Base, Lieutenant Salas, who was in charge at the time of the March 1967 incident there, had this to say in response to the official position. If you consider the fact that this UFO incident resulted in the loss of 20 missiles during the Cold War and the Vietnam War, this was a national security threat. The Air Force is not telling us the truth. Obviously, these are, moreover, only 2 of many such close encounters with UFOs that have grave implications for US national security, which have taken place for decades before AATIP and the UAP task force were recently set up. One of the most dramatic was at US Air Force facility in Britain, the joint USAF-NATO twin bases of RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge in Suffolk. The twin bases are separated by Rendelsham Forest, which was the center of the close encounter on Christmas night of 1980, and 2 nights later on December 27, when the UFOs returned. Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt and 3 men from the 81st Security Police Squadron, namely Airman Jim Peniston, John Burroughs, and Ed Kavansak, The incident is detailed in a report submitted to the Ministry of Defense of the United Kingdom by Colonel Holt, together with his tape recording of his observations during the incident, as well as drawings of markings that he observed of the craft. You see, unlike the recent disclosures of close encounters of the first kind, namely observations of UFOs or tracking data on them, the Rendelsham forest incident was a close encounter of the second kind, the landing of a UFO and up-close observation of it. After playing with the officers as they wandered through the forest in pursuit of it, one of the several of the UFOs, a triangular-shaped craft, about 9 feet long and 6.5 feet high, landed and left 3 depressions in the dirt. These indentations were subsequently examined with a Geiger counter and found to be emitting significantly higher than normal background radiation, 7 times higher in fact. Most astonishingly, while the UFO was sitting there, Colonel Holt got close enough to place his hand on the surface of the mysterious object, which was inscribed with symbols that reminded him of hieroglyphics. Holt drew these in detail and submitted them as part of his report to the MOD. This is how he describes that unforgettable moment. When we came up on the triangular-shaped craft, there were blue and yellow lights swirling around the exterior as though part of the surface and the air around us were electrically charged. We could feel it in our clothes, skin and hair. It felt like static electricity, which made our hair stand up and dance on your skin. But there was no sound at all coming from the craft. Nothing in my training prepared me for what we were witnessing. This was no type of aircraft that I had ever seen before. On one side of the aircraft were symbols that measured about 3 inches high and 2.5 feet across. These symbols were pictorial in design. The largest symbol was a triangle which was centered in the middle of the others. They were etched into the surface of the craft. I put my hand on the craft and it was warm to touch. The surface was smooth like glass, but it had the quality of metal, and I felt a constant low voltage running through my hand and moving to my mid-forearm. Holt spent no less than 45 minutes in this kind of proximity to the UFO. Then, as its lights intensified, he and his men backed away and watched as the craft maneuvered through the trees before shooting up and away at what he described in his logbook as speed impossible. Aircraft control operators at Bentwaters base tracked the object on radar, achieving 4,000 miles per hour instantaneously from having been basically stationary. What puts this event into the same class as the incidents at Minot and Maelstorm bases is that the UFO sent beams down into a nuclear weapons storage area. This was America's largest tactical nuclear weapons depot in all of Europe. By the late 1960s, the National Military Command had grown so concerned about UFO incursions at Strategic Air Command nuclear facilities that it put the Air Force's entire nuclear weapons arsenal on high alert for potential deployment. Some of the UFO incidents gravely affecting US national security are actually from the files of the former Soviet Union. Next to the United States of America, the other nation with the most extensive and mostly classified governmental knowledge of the close encounter phenomenon is Russia. This is undoubtedly not only because of the vast geographical expanse of Russia, but also on account of the fact that during the height of the modern UFO phenomenon from 1947 to 1991, Russia's Soviet Empire was one of the 2 superpowers vying for world domination, including especially in the frontier of space, where for a period in the 1950s and early 1960s, Soviet cosmonauts outspaced American astronauts. In other words, the Russians were together with Americans on the front lines of encounters with UFOs. For example, in October of 1964, the Soviet spacecraft Voskhod 1 and Voskhod 2 were both prematurely forced to return to Earth after the cosmonauts on board reported that they were repeatedly overtaken by extremely fast-flying disks, which struck the craft violently, shattering blows with their powerful magnetic fields. Too few in the West are aware of the extent to which Russia's homegrown futurist cosmism, especially the more Promethean variety of it, was embraced by the Soviet Union and became part of the backbone of its ideological mission to forge a new man. As in the case of the United States, as far back as 1959, the tactical missile command facilities of the Soviet Union were also regularly overflown by the UFOs that easily outmaneuvered the fighter aircraft that were scrambled to intercept them in the restricted airspace of these sensitive facilities. A now declassified KGB document reveals that on the night of July 28, 1989, at Kapustin Yar military complex, dozens of Soviet military personnel observed a disc-shaped object with a dome hovering over the base's nuclear weapons depot and directing laser beams into the roof of a building storing nuclear weapons before speeding off. 7 years earlier, on October 4, 1982, at a base near the Ukrainian town of Belokhorovich, a yellowish-orange glowing flying disc activated several nuclear missiles, initiating a countdown to launch without anyone having entered the authorization codes. This went on for 15 seconds of sheer terror before everything returned to normal operational status. These UFO incidents affect US national security in that they may have precipitated a nuclear holocaust that would have annihilated both USA and USSR and irradiated the rest of our planet. Consider the close call of October 5, 1960, when a whole formation of UFOs heading across the North Atlantic from the direction of the Soviet Union toward the United States was mistaken for an incoming Russian nuclear strike by the computerized early warning system of the American base at Thule, Greenland. Strategic Air Command in Nebraska was notified by the system automatically, but when SAC tried to contact Thule for confirmation, they received no response. Later, it was determined that at just this moment, an iceberg supposedly cut the submarine cable in the North Atlantic that connected the base in Greenland to the continental United States. What are the odds of this being an accident? Since they could not reach Thule, SAC assumed that the base had already been hit as part of a Soviet first strike. The US Strategic Command signaled the B-52 bombers in the vicinity of the USSR to initiate a massive nuclear strike. Fortunately, before they carried out this mission, the blips on the radar screen changed course and then disappeared. The Air Force claimed that the misleading radar signatures, which almost caused World War III, had actually bounced off the moon, leading to the misinterpretation of them. What bounced off the moon? Contrary to the US Air Force when it closed Project Blue Book, and of the Condone Commission at the University of Colorado, whose executive summary contradicts one would reasonably conclude from a detailed study of the contents of their own analysis of the Blue Book case files, high-level officials within the US government have been ringing alarm bells about the grave national security implications of UFOs for decades. In 1960, no less a personage than the first director of the CIA, Vice Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, broke with the CIA's 1953 Robertson panel decision to cover up UFO incidents while promoting public ridicule of those who report them. "It is time for the truth to be brought out in open congressional hearings," said Admiral Hillenkoetter. The former CIA director informed the public that, "Behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about the UFOs. But through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe that the unknown flying objects are nonsense. To hide the facts, the Air Force has silenced its personnel." Hillenkoetter entered an urgent warning into the US congressional record through Congressman Leonard G. Wolf to the effect that one of the gravest dangers linked to the unidentified flying objects is that they could cause World War III by being mistaken for incoming Soviet missiles. "If we persist in refusing to recognize the existence of UFOs, we will end up, one fine day, by mistaking them for the guided missiles of an enemy, and the worst will be upon us." Closed quotes. Not only did Hillenkoetter's call for congressional hearings go unheeded, the Air Force hid the most serious close encounters from those managing its own Project Blue Book, which was nothing more than a public relations charade. A now declassified October 1969 memorandum written by Air Force Brigadier General Carol H. Bolender makes it clear that UFO reports that had implications for national security were never reported through the Blue Book system in the first place, and that they were handled by another highly classified procedure, whose protocol predated Blue Book and continued to operate after the PR front was shut down. Scientific study of UFOs. Thanks to testimony from John G. Callahan, Division Chief of the Accidents Evaluation and Investigations Division of the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, we know that the serious scientific study of UFOs by the US government was being handled by none other than Hillenkoetter's own agency, the CIA. Big surprise, and it was ongoing as late as 1987. When coordinating with military brass, Callahan has a rank equivalent to general. In January of 1987, Callahan attended a meeting with 3 CIA agents and a few other men who were identified as scientific advisors to President Reagan. He presented a detailed FAA reconstruction of the infamous November 7, 1986 Japan Airlines encounter with aircraft carrier-sized spaceships, as Captain Terauchi described them. This spectacular event, which involved a near collision of JAL Flight 1628 with the UFOs, witnessed by many on board, took place over Anchorage, Alaska, and was tracked over FAA radar. The radar returns recording the relative positions of the spaceships and the airliner were synced with voice recordings of communications from Captain Terauchi with air traffic control to produce a reconstruction of the entire event. One of the CIA agents at the meeting excitedly told Callahan that this was the first time they have over 30 minutes of radar data to go over in their analysis of UFOs. In response to Callahan's insistence that the matter be made public, the CIA analyst retorted, "No way! If we were to tell the American public there are UFOs, they would panic." He added, "This event never happened. We were never here. We are confiscating all this data, and you are all sworn to secrecy." Fortunately, Callahan kept his own copy of the data and has since presented it publicly at press conferences. Just how far the CIA and other such agencies of the US government have gotten with their scientific analysis of UFOs over the course of decades can be surmised based on a study of how far some intrepid scientists have gotten with unclassified studies of this subject. The most prominent of these scientists, and the single individual who has done the most in-depth and rigorous empirical analysis of UFOs, is Paul Hill. He was a NASA scientist whose specialty was the engineering of flying platforms of a kind that might have been used by astronauts on the moon, had the Apollo program not been terminated for reasons that we will explore in subsequent chapters. Hill had been among the many people to witness a UFO during the infamous flap of the summer of 1952, when Washington, D.C. was repeatedly subjected to waves of aerial invasion by UFOs, including in restricted airspace above the White House. The performance characteristics of these craft, which Hill had witnessed himself, had bearing on the problem of engineering platforms that could tilt in flight. So Hill began amassing a huge database of empirical data concerning UFOs, not just sightings but also radar tracking records and landing traces. His main open sources for this data were the very professional public organizations that had already been set up to investigate UFOs, namely the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, APRO, and the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP. Since he worked at NASA, and the official position of NASA, even during the course of Project Blue Book, was that there are no real UFOs, that is, craft not made by any terrestrial nation, Hill had to remain silent about his research. Although he concluded his study in 1975, it could only be published posthumously. Hill died in 1990 and his study was published in 1995. It has since garnered the endorsement of Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell and the aeronautical engineer Robert M. Wood, who received his PhD in physics from Cornell University before working as research and development manager at McDonnell Douglas Corporation from 1961 to 1993. Hill's main objective in his scientific analysis of UFOs is to demonstrate that their performance characteristics do not defy the laws of physics, but can be explained in accordance with known scientific principles and in terms of extensions of extant lines of technological development. Unconventional Flying Objects is a scientific book full of equations and graphs that organize data about UFO performance with a view to identifying patterns that would allow one to deduce what kind of propulsion systems, navigational principles, and metallurgical engineering could account for what has been observed. To begin with, Hill identifies 10 different types of UFOs, including various subtypes of saucers and cigar-shaped craft. He analyzes every type of motion that has been observed, and in the case of radar tapes also recorded, in close encounters of the first and second kind with these objects, including the falling leaf, silver dollar wobble, acute angle turns, sudden reversals of direction, bank and turn, straightaway speed runs, and very significantly, the tilt to maneuver, Lenticular or saucer-shaped UFOs, which enter and exit much larger cigar-shaped craft, always tilt with their leading edge down so that from the bottom of the saucer they can direct an anti-gravitational force field at what they want to move away from, and in such a manner as it orients the trajectory to the place that they want to move toward. This force field is what is responsible for knocking witnesses backwards if they are facing the bottom of a tilting UFO, or for parting and breaking free, or breaking tree branches without direct contact, or knocking a truck over, breaking a car windshield in, dislodging roof tiles, or repelling rocks thrown at a saucer with the same kinetic energy that the rock has when it impacts the force field. That is, rocks do not simply fall when they hit this field, they spring back. The optical characteristics of UFO sightings are painstakingly scrutinized toward the end of concluding what is responsible for the shift from a red-orange luminosity at low power operation to a blue-white color at high power in the plasma cloud of ionization that encompasses UFOs and make it so difficult to take clear and crisp photographs of a craft's contours. Replication of these features by Hill in a laboratory with an ion plasma enveloped saucer model inside of a supersonic wind tunnel test rig produced sharp images that show exactly why it is so difficult to photograph genuine UFOs. Hill also undertakes a careful study of the nests and rings left by UFOs in reeds or other soft terrain, especially with a view to organic transformation and radiological signatures, as well as traces from landing gear that would allow for estimates of weight. For example, Hill was able to identify precisely what range of radiation is emitted by UFOs. It is between 25 electron volts at the bottom of the X-ray band up to 3 million electron volts at the lower end of the gamma ray spectrum, which at close exposure for as little as 10 minutes could be a lethal dose if a landed UFO is turned on the quotes, and still radiating energy. It would appear that such craft may be internally shielded against the radiation that one can be exposed to at their periphery. Do not approach a landed UFO, especially if it is emitting palpable heat. Interestingly, however, Hill also concluded that it is the ultrasonic frequencies emitted by UFOs that sometimes result in burns on those in close proximity to the craft. These are not radiation burns on the goods, although a person might also be irradiated. They are more akin to abrasions, resulting from cellular destruction by high-frequency sound waves, the barely audible hum on the course that some hear during close encounters. The aim here has not been to present anything like an adequate summary of Hill's findings, but only to convey a sense of the level of detail and degree of precision involved in his scientific study of UFOs. By no means is he alone in such painstaking research of a mass of reliable first-rate reports of close encounters available in open-source databases such as those maintained by APRO and NICAP. Hill's study was finally released in 1995. 2 years later, in the early fall of 1997, Lawrence S. Rockefeller funded a very high-level scientific study of UFOs at his secluded Pocantino Conference Center in Tarrytown, New York. The participants included tens of prominent scientists in numerous fields. The director of the study was Peter A. Sturrock, Professor Emeritus of Applied Physics and Emeritus Director of the Center of Space Science and Astrophysics at Stanford University, the recipient of numerous prestigious awards and the author of more than 200 scientific papers. In consultation with Rockefeller, Sturrock put together a scientific steering committee that included Dr. Thomas E. Holzer of the High Altitude Observatory at the National Center for Atmospheric Research at Boulder, Colorado, Dr. Robert John, Professor of Aerospace and Dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Princeton University, Dr. David E. Pritchard, Professor of Physics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Dr. Harold E. Puthoff, Director of the Institute of Advanced Studies at Austin, Texas, Dr. Charles R. Tolbert, Professor of Astronomy at the University of Virginia, and Dr. Yervan Terzian, Professor of Astronomy and Chairman of the Astronomy Department of Cornell University. This steering committee devised the plan for investigations and presentations by an international group of scientists who were designated as investigators. These included Dr. Richard F. Haynes of NASA from Los Altos, California, Dr. Illobrand von Ludwiger of Friedrichshain, West Ham, Germany, Dr. Mark Rodeger of Center of UFO Studies in Chicago, Dr. Erling Strand of Østfold, Norway, Dr. Michael Schwartz, Professor of Science at Eastern Michigan University, Dr. Jacques F. Vallée of San Francisco, Dr. Jean-Jacques Velasco of Centre National d'Etudes Spatiales, CNES, the French equivalent of NASA, Dr. François Louange, Managing Director of Fleximage Paris, France, who is an expert in photographic analysis, Dr. S. J. Meloche, Professor of Planetary Science at the University of Arizona in Tucson, who is a geologist, Dr. James J. Papike, Head of the Institute of Meteoritics and Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, who is an expert on phenomena of the upper atmosphere, Dr. Gunther Reis of the German Aerospace Center at the Institute for Aerospace Medicine in Cologne, Germany, who is an expert in radiation injuries, and Dr. Bernard Veyret of the Bioelectromagnetics Laboratory at the University of Bordeaux, France, whose expertise is plant biology. The Rockefeller-funded study group in New York took as its point of departure a negative evaluation of the Condone report. The aforementioned scientists concluded that Professor Edward U. Condone of the University of Colorado wrote a project summary of the nearly 1,000-page scientific study of unidentified flying objects published in 1969, which conflicted with the actual detailed reports and analysis featured in it. At that time, this contradiction had prompted strong protests from both James McDonald and J. Allen Hynek. Professor Hynek's protest was considered especially noteworthy since he was the scientific director of the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book that produced the mass of data analyzed by the Colorado Project and misleadingly summarized by Condon. Shortly thereafter, Hynek went on the record that the Condon report summary findings, which do not reflect the actual study, was a part of a cover-up. In any case, Starbuck's group agreed that, contrary to Condon's conclusions, which formed the basis for the official US government position in UFOs by 1970, UFOs are a genuinely enigmatic phenomena that merits serious scientific study, which could lead to extraordinary breakthroughs. This conclusion was based on the extensive study by the tens of scientists listed above, which includes analysis of UFO luminosity with a view to energetic physics, rigorous evaluation of photographic evidence, review of radar recordings, geological and chemical analysis of landing traces, and even some study of slag and other metallic substances left behind by UFOs. The mass of this evidence, they decided, could not be explained away with reference to any known phenomena. The panel recommended the establishment in the United States and other countries of an organization modeled on French government's GAPAN/SERPA UFO study project, which managed through a coordination between CNES, France's NASA, and the French Gendarmerie. 6 objectives were defined for such an organization. Number 1. Such a project could be mandated to obtain access to relevant data such as police records, radar records, etc. Number 2. The project could organize and draw upon a network of laboratories and consultants. Number 3. The project could set up and maintain a central database. Number 4. The project could construct and operate one or more mobile observatories that would include a number of cameras and other detectors, including, as a minimum, optical, infrared, spectroscopic, acoustic, magnetic, and radiation instruments. Number 5. New cases could be investigated from the outset purely on the basis of data collected through official channels and procedures. Number 6. If there is indeed a health hazard associated with some events related to the UFO problem, some government office should offer a response to this hazard. This program was recommended more than 20 years ago by an illustrious group of 20 scientists who gave as much care to studying various aspects of the close encounter phenomena as Paul Hill did in his scientific study of UFOs 2 decades before them. In view of this level of open source research and public analysis of empirical data, it is preposterous to claim that the CIA and other agencies of the United States government have not undertaken a similar, if not much deeper and more extensive, scientific study of the UFO phenomenon. We have clearly heard Callahan's testimony to this effect, which establishes that the CIA was scientifically studying UFOs in the 1980s, but such a study extends decades further into the past than that. Consider the testimony of Wilbur Smith, a scientist with a high-level security clearance working on the Canadian government, often in a liaison capacity that involved close work with upper echelons in the U.S. national security establishment. As clearly as 1958, Smith went on record saying that knowledge about UFOs was classified higher than the Manhattan Project, by the U.S. government, and he added that various items of hardware are known to exist, but they are usually promptly clapped into security and therefore are not available to the general public. Substances such as angel hair and molten tin, etc., have been observed to drop from this craft and have been gathered and analyzed. Strong magnetic disturbances have been observed in the vicinity of this craft. In fact, I would say that many more people have more evidence supporting the reality of the flying saucers than for the reality of atom bombs. But atom bombs bear the stamp of official disclosure, and in posting your representative with questions, please be sure the questions you ask are exactly what you want to know. If you ask, does the Air Force have any source or hardware? You will get no, truthfully. The hardware is not held by the Air Force. Smith admitted that he himself had held a piece of this hardware at one point, and when a reporter asked whether he was forced to return it to the Air Force, he said, "Not the Air Force, much higher than that." The reporter forced the question, "The Central Intelligence Agency?" At this point, Smith laughed nervously as he replied, "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I don't care to go beyond that point. I can say that it went into the hands of a highly classified group. You will have to solve that problem, their identity, for yourselves." Not incidentally, before returning this material to this highly classified group, underquotes, Wilbert Smith was able to have a fragment weighing 83 grams cut off of it with a diamond saw. This he sent to a laboratory whose chemical analysis concluded that it was iron oxide combined with magnesium silicate in a matrix composed of particles measuring 15 microns, underquotes. In other words, this 1952 material was nano-engineered. This case is from the archives of Jacques Vallée, one of the most respected scientists to have spent decades studying close encounters. Vallée has his own small collection of slag and other metallic material left behind by UFOs, which he has had analyzed. What he found was that while none of these materials are extraterrestrial in elemental composition, in some of these samples, the isotopic ratios of magnesium have been artificially altered. What this means is that while UFOs may be constructed somewhere on Earth, or using elements from Earth, they are constructed by people who, in the 1950s, had the technological capability of altering the isotopic ratios of these elements, in order, for example, to make metal much more durable. That kind of technical accomplishment was not supposed to have been feasible even for the world's leading nuclear scientists in America and Russia until decades after the 1950s. On the eve of June 2021 Pentagon report, Vallée offered these observations regarding the expected disclosure, underquotes, from the US government. Bear in mind, while reading this, that Vallée, who is both a computer scientist and an astronomer, has himself worked on a number of highly classified US government projects, including the development of core architecture of the Defense Advanced Research Projects (ARPA) network for the Pentagon, which became the Internet, as well as the first digital mapping of Mars for NASA. Here is what he has to say about disclosure. The people who hope for an imminent disclosure about UFOs and who are making valiant efforts to document the phenomenon should take one important fact into account. Disclosure could only come from the same organizations that are in charge of the security brief itself. And those organizations have their own agenda and constraints, which may be regrettable, but possibly legitimate. A government entity or its classified contractors can claim to know the answers and confuse the issues with impunity. It can even come up with fake disclosures to feed the public's thirst for what passes for truth, underquotes, and the media's excitement to promote it, in the interest of what may be perceived as a higher good. Any disclosure will be managed by the same groups that have safely managed the dossier for the last 75 years, and they can spin it to their liking, claiming that the military must retain control. They can also reposition it in any shape and context they want through the multiple cutouts, underquotes, they can create out of thin air to send us into blind alleys. That's what they do. Nobody can put pressure on such an organization. If you are not cleared by them, you can contradict them. If you are, you're certainly not about to contradict them. State sovereignty and the UFO. So why disclosure now? After secretly studying the UFO phenomenon for more than a half a century, while engaging in vociferous public denial, disinformation and disingenuous ridicule, why is the US government finally disclosing what, as late as 1987, the CIA still believed would panic the public? First, I will answer this question with the more or less official line. What the UAP disclosure lobby, consisting of military intelligence officials such as Louis Elizondo and affiliated journalists like Leslie Kean, would have us believe is something like the following. In the aftermath of the trauma of World War II and throughout the very tense and paranoid Cold War, the US military and intelligence community panicked and handled the UFO phenomenon irresponsibly. Even after the end of the Cold War, when the governments of a number of other nations, including NATO allies such as Belgium and France, began to take a more open approach towards UFOs. America, which found itself in the position of now being the sole superpower of the world, was reluctant to admit the existence of a technologically superior other against which even it had no effective defense. Meanwhile, in part due to its own disinformation campaign, such as the public ridicule policy that the CIA's Robertson panel recommended, the UFO subject had been synonymous with lurid sci-fi images of space aliens and little green men, so that any public official that engaged with the subject would lose credibility and be unable to govern effectively. However, the public openness to the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence has increased significantly over the decades, together with the percentage of Americans convinced that their government was not disclosing all that it knew about UFOs. Consequently, a rebranding of the now prurient UFO as UAP, when coupled with a militantly agnostic attitude toward what this unknown aerial phenomena might be, not necessarily alien spacecraft, could serve to clean the slate of US government engagement with this enigma. A group such as the UAP Task Force, the establishment of which Leslie Kean essentially proposed in a landmark UFOs book of 2010, could mark the beginning of public collection and analysis of UAP data by the American government, and most importantly, serious scientific study of the phenomenon in collaboration with other governments and international organizations. This is the preposterous semi-official line in response to the question, why now? Anyone who has seriously studied the UFO phenomenon knows that it is patently absurd. It is also disingenuous, as one can tell if one reads between the lines of the writings of those who pretend that this is their position. For example, in UFOs, generals, pilots, and government officials go on the record. Leslie Kean admits that the 1999 Cometa report of the French Institute of Higher Studies for National Defense is what got her interested in the UFO subject to begin with, and she writes of French General Bernard Nolan with great respect. However, in the Cometa report, Nolan, former commander of the French Tactical Air Force, and his collaborators, which included André Levaux, who as president of the CNES was the head of the French equivalent of NASA, concluded that the American military had recovered crash saucer material and was engaged in reverse engineering UFOs while jealously concealing its advanced scientific knowledge of the subject even from its closest allies. Furthermore, in chapter 13 of their study, Cometa goes on the record, recognizing that the UFO phenomenon is of extreme antiquity, such that pre-industrial civilizations of Earth were shaped by it on a level that includes fundamental religious beliefs, so that a full disclosure and comprehensive public understanding of the phenomena might lead to the collapse of religious belief systems and to consequently catastrophic socio-political upheaval. Meanwhile, in her hefty book on UFOs, Kean, who has so much respect for Nolan and claims to be deeply in debt to Cometa, devotes less than one sentence to the potential religious implications of UFO disclosure when, in a passage comparing the UFO taboo to denial in psychoanalysis, she says that some people prefer not to contemplate the subject at all, because they fear, even if only on a subconscious level, that there will be religious conflicts, Really? Is that so? To her credit, Kean does provide a platform for Dr. Alexander Wendt and Dr. Raymond Duval, co-authors of a paper titled Sovereignty and the UFO, published in the prominent scholarly journal Political Theory. However, their contributions to her volume of expert testimony winds up being the most duplicitous part of her book. Kean uses them, more than any other of her contributors, to make the case for militant agnosticism, with respect to what UFOs, UAP, might actually be. This is essentially a psychological manipulation tactic intended to short-circuit the thought process that denies the reality of UFOs on account of the fear of the existence of technologically superior alien intelligence. We have no idea what they are. They are just a marvelous unknown that should be scientifically studied. The idea is that promoting this attitude, when combined with a rebranding of UFOs as UAPs, will bypass the fear response at the bottom of both public ridicule and government denial. Yet, Wendt and Duval know better than anyone that the fear response is absolutely justified when one considers UFOs from the standpoint of political theory. Our thesis is that the origins of this taboo are political. As political scientists, we are concerned with a possible connection between the need to dismiss the UFO and the way in which modern peoples organize and govern their societies. The inability to see clearly and talk rationally about UFOs seems to be a symptom of authoritative anxiety, a socially subconscious fear of what the reality of UFO might mean for modern government. The threat is threefold. On the most obvious level, acceptance of the possibility that the UFO is truly unidentified and that therefore an unknown, very powerful other, underquotes, might actually exist, represents a potential physical threat. Clearly, if some other civilization has the ability to visit Earth, then it has vastly superior technology to human beings, which raises the possibility of colonization or even extermination. As such, the UFO calls into question the state's ability to protect its citizens from such an invasion. Second, governments may also be reacting to the possibility that a confirmation of extraterrestrial presence would create tremendous pressure for a world government, which today's territorial states would be loath to form. The sovereign identity of modern states depends on their difference from one another. Anything that required subsuming this difference into a global sovereignty would threaten the fundamental structure of these states, quite apart from the risk of physical destruction. Third, however, and in our view most important, the extraterrestrial possibility calls into question what we call the anthropocentric nature of modern sovereignty. Such anthropocentrism or human-centeredness is a modern assumption, one less common in prehistoric and ancient times when the gods were considered more powerful than human beings and thought to rule. Significantly, it is on this anthropocentric basis that modern states are able to command exceptional loyalty and resources from their subjects. Because a possible explanation for the UFO phenomenon is extraterrestrial, taking UFOs seriously calls this deeply held assumption into question. It raises the possibility of something analogous to the materialization of God, as in the Christians' second coming, underquotes. To whom would people give their loyalty in such a situation? And could states in their present form survive were such a question politically salient? Our contention is that the political survival of the modern state depends on that question not being politically salient. As such, an authoritative taboo on UFOs is functionally necessary for rule to be sustained in its present form. Well, there you have it. The reasons given by Wendt and Duval in their study of sovereignty and the UFO, underquotes, are reason enough for the decades-long UFO cover-up, especially by the United States and Russia. In the sphere of political philosophy, the preeminent German legal theorist Carl Schmitt already understood this by the 1960s. In works such as Nomos of the Earth 1950 and Theory of the Partition 1962, Schmitt reaches back to an ominous remark that he made in his classic Concept of the Political 1932 to the effect that there could never be a unified government of humanity because the human species as such has no inhuman or radical alien enemy, at least not on this planet, underquotes. In the context of Schmitt's thought, sovereign authority is fundamentally grounded on the distinction between friend and enemy. Whatever form such an authority takes, republican, monarchical, or some other form, the sovereign of the state is he or she who decides with respect to the enemy. There can be no legitimate world government because no matter how repugnant an enemy may be in the eyes of any particular nation, the enemy does not cease to be human, and there is no inhuman enemy that could justify the formation of a sovereign authority universal to humanity. In Schmitt's view, attempts to constitute such authorities, such as the United Nations and the League of Nations that preceded it, or for that matter the Communist International, all involve an attempted dehumanization of the enemy. He is horrified by the idea that instead of distinct national militaries, we would have a global police force that would hunt down enemies as if they were inhuman criminals or vermin, with no borders to retreat behind and no possibility of concluding a ceasefire treaty even after accepting a military defeat. Related to this is another feature of Schmitt's thought that becomes particularly clear in Nomos of the Earth 1950. The legitimacy of state power, as defined by its nomos or legal order, can only be justified if there is an outside with respect to the interiority of their political space. Unless there is a free space wherein a dynamic interplay of forces is possible beyond the boundaries of any one or another state, the legal order of that state would have to be seen as tyrannical, totalitarian in form, however liberal it may seem in content. The idea of a homeland, heimat, is very important to Smith. But what makes a place one's home is the possibility of living it and striking out into unexplored regions or foreign territory. Such wandering and exploration, which includes not just frontier settlement and colonization, but also the possibility of defection to a foreign country, is the condition of possibility for homesickness, undergoes. A state that encompasses the entire world cannot be a homeland anymore, cannot be a homeland to anyone, since it does not belong to any Volk as a heimat. Such an entity cannot even be described as a state in a properly political sense. Every state is based on sovereign authority, and the basis of a sovereign's authority is the protection of his own, people against some other, people defined as the enemy. It is he or she who defines that enemy, since even if there is a constitutional order or if there are treaties in place that might have bearing on whether one or another nation is considered an enemy, it is in the end the sovereign who interprets these legal instruments. This brings us to a third basic feature of Smith's political philosophy. The nature of sovereign authority is revealed with exceptional clarity in a state of emergency. Whether it is a war or a natural catastrophe, including a plague, or some other crisis that requires exceptions to normal legal practice, or even suspension of the Constitution altogether, the maintenance of public order in the absence of formal law attests to the actual character of sovereign authority. It also reveals who the real sovereign is, if under such circumstances it is some other individual or organization besides the president, king, or parliament that is actually able to maintain order in practice. Then the state of emergency will have served to reveal the true sovereign of the state in question. This could, for example, be a religious order or a mega corporation that is either more trusted or seen as more capable than the government that is tested by the emergency. Only that body who can authoritatively and effectively decide who lives and who dies, the body that can legitimately demand of citizens that they go out to die for their country in a war, or who decides what certain people must be left to die so that others can survive a certain catastrophe. Only that body is sovereign. Liberals mistake the logic of political order for the procedures of debate teams or the policies of economists. The political has its own specific concept, which is different from the concept of the economic or the concept of open debate and discussion. The properly political is always, in the end, a matter of life and death. Any state that attempts to reduce the political to the economic and to substitute sovereign authority with indefinite democratic debate will wind up being a failed state when it faces a crisis that is grave enough to expose its fundamental misunderstanding of political order. One consequence of this is that, as Schmidt argues in The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, liberal democratic regimes of representative government fail to recognize that authority does not lie with the people, through legislation passed by their representatives. Ultimate authority lies with a person or tightly knit group of persons who, when system of law fails to be adequate to the demands of a catastrophic crisis, can effectively dictate what must be done to save lives and protect property. The legitimacy of a sovereign dictates in such a situation, or the lack thereof, will hinge on whether the sovereign is seen to embody the ethos of the people and to govern on the basis of it. This ethos is the true constitution of a people, not what is written on a piece of paper by legislators and technocrats. As Smith points out in Political Theology, this means that there can be no truly secular regime. The government may appear secular on paper, but in the state of emergency, the sovereign can only govern based on the deepest religious convictions of his people. This is clear from how many times God or the gods are evoked by state officials in time of extreme crisis, whether a terrible war or a natural catastrophe. It is also one of the reasons why the communists lost the great ideological struggle of the 20th century. With these three basic features of Smith's political thought in mind, let us look back at that ominous qualifier from The Concept of the Political, 1932. At least not on this planet. It needs to be put next to a section in Theory of the Partisan, 1962, where Schmidt contemplates the possibility that certain menacing advances in technology such as miniaturized nuclear weapons, combined with the proliferation of orbital satellites, imperil the entire planet and define Earth as a properly political space for the first time. Schmidt confesses that this potential for cosmopartisans and cosmopirates to threaten the whole planet from space may require a rethinking of nomos of the Earth. Taking this together with this qualifier in concept of the political, it is legitimate to conclude that if the humans of all known nations on Earth were to be confronted with an apparently extraterrestrial entity that could even potentially be defined as an enemy, then sovereign authority would have to be restructured on a planetary scale. In the face of this global state of emergency, there could be a number of possibilities, and none of them would be welcome from the perspective of the political leadership of any great nation. One possibility would simply be to surrender to the technologically superior extraterrestrials and hope for the best in terms of what they have in store for us. Another possibility is that, for the sake of common defense of the independence of our planet, the nations of the Earth would all have to unify under a single government, perhaps by endowing an institution such as the United Nations in New York City with actual political authority and attempting to appoint a Secretary General who would be universally accepted as a legitimate sovereign in Schmidt's sense. This is extremely unlikely because there is yet no global ethos that this sovereign could legitimately govern on the basis of in a situation wherein procedural law is inadequate. Furthermore, sovereign nations, and especially the world powers, are not likely to surrender their sovereignty to such an egalitarian and bureaucratic organization. It is far more likely that a temporary alliance would be formed between them, like the alliance of America and Britain with the Soviet Union for the sake of defeating Nazi Germany. However, in such a scenario, it is always possible that one of the world powers, or even a superpower, will break with other world powers and negotiate a separate peace with the extraterrestrials, perhaps in exchange for preferred status as a managerial class in the context of colonization. This danger highlights the need for centralized authority, even if not under an ineffective bureaucracy such as the UN, then at least under an effective global hegemony forged by a single superpower. This superpower could extend its defense umbrella over the entire planet and during the world state of emergency assume certain vital functions of government for other failed or failing states, at least until the extraterrestrials are dealt with in a manner that provides for long-term global security. Until very recently, when the rise of China has called this into question, it has been assumed that the USA with its NATO umbrella would be the superpower that, with hundreds of military bases honeycombing the entire planet, would step forward as this hegemon and guardian of Earth. Consequently, the relationship between sovereignty and the UFO has a special significance when it comes to the United States. What Leslie Kean does not seem to understand, or pretends not to understand, when she asks why the United States cannot be as open as other governments are about the UFO subject, is that, especially with regard to our NATO allies and the South American countries that she focuses on, these countries are used to thinking of themselves as already having lost their sovereignty. They do not admit this publicly because it would be humiliating, and perhaps they even try not to think about it too much. But citizens of countries like Belgium already see themselves as living under this sovereign authority of the United States. What matters is not what their own governments say, but what the American government is prepared to say. Belgians have not panicked about the intense UFO flap and mass close encounters that took place in their country in November of 1989, because the Americans haven't yet confirmed the authenticity of them. That observation may be politically incorrect, but it is true. Belgians are still hoping that the Galactic Empire Star Destroyer-sized craft that hundreds of people saw suspended in the night sky over their towns in the airspace of the country that hosts NATO were some kind of exotic super-secret US military aircraft made at Area 51. It does not matter to them that Major General Wilfred D. Brewer claims that he checked with his American counterparts and they assured him that these UFOs were not experimental US aircraft. Surely the Americans would not feel obliged to confess that to a Belgian NATO lackey, they think to themselves. It is quite another thing if the United States government itself comes out and insists that it does not know what these things are. The same would have been true of the Soviet Union, to respect to all of the Warsaw Pact states. The USA NATO and the USSR WP represented rival bids for sovereignty over Earth. the UFO poses a fundamental challenge to sovereignty in ways that even Wendt and Duval have not come close to comprehending.